for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Godzilla's Revenge, or as it was known in Japan, All Monsters Attack, making this the overall 10th installment of the Godzilla franchise to be directed by Ichiro Honda yet again. And before I go any further with the production history of Godzilla's Revenge, if you recall the production history behind Destroy All Monsters, that movie was originally intended to be the last installment of the Godzilla franchise, because around that time period, Japanese movie-going audiences were getting giant monster movie fatigue, and the producers of Toho Studios decided to put all their eggs into one basket with the intention of having Destroy All Monsters be the end-all, be-all giant monster movie bash. But sure enough, the movie was both a critical and financial success, making the producers over at Toho Studios to rethink their strategy and continue making more Godzilla movies in the same vein as the Gamera movies that are coming out around this time period, since not only were the Gamera movies just as popular as the Godzilla movies, but those movies were geared towards children, which led Toho into creating Godzilla's Revenge. And all I gotta say is, this movie was a long time coming for me, because when I decided to start doing reviews of all the Godzilla movies, I think out of any Godzilla movie, this is the one Godzilla movie I dread the most in terms of rewatching, because the main reason as to why I dreaded rewatching this movie the most when it came to reviewing these Godzilla movies all had to do with when I first saw Godzilla's Revenge. Because back in 2004, at the time, it was the overall 50th anniversary of the Godzilla franchise. And Sony, along with some other company, were re-releasing all the Godzilla movies on DVD. And around this time period, I started collecting all the Godzilla movies, or as many as I could get my hands on at the time. And when it came to picking out these Godzilla movies, I would often look at what the DVD cover looked like, followed by what roster of monsters appeared within the movie, without reading the plot synopsis. And sure enough, when I did go to my local mall to buy a Godzilla movie, I remember picking out this one Godzilla movie because of how strange the DVD cover was, because it looked very bad. But then you read the movie title, it says Godzilla's Revenge, and I was like, Godzilla's Revenge? That sounds intense. And then I looked at the back to see what monsters appeared in the movie, and I was like, wow, all these monsters appear in this movie? Does Godzilla fight every single one of these? If so, that would be epic. So then at that exact moment, I remember buying the movie, I went home, sat down, I began watching Godzilla's Revenge, and by the time the movie ended, I remember being really disappointed by what I saw. Because at the time, I had certain expectations as to what I thought the movie was going to be about. However, as I sat there watching Godzilla's Revenge, I was just like, what kind of bullshit is this? And thus, the movie left a really big negative impact with me, to the point that I literally haven't seen this movie since 2004. Like, I've seen the 1998 Godzilla movie more times than Godzilla's Revenge, and I'd rather be watching the 1998 movie instead of this movie any day of the week. And when it comes to the Godzilla fan base, this movie is often considered to be one of the worst, if not the worst Godzilla movie of the entire franchise. However, recently there have been several groups of people out there who are actually starting to defend the movie, saying it's actually not that bad, to a point that it's actually one of the more underappreciated installments of the franchise, which leads me into my big question for the movie. Is Godzilla's Revenge still the worst Godzilla movie out there? As for the plot to this movie, it's about this schoolboy who's grown up in Tokyo, and every time he comes home from school, he often comes home to an empty apartment because his parents are constantly working. Thus, he is always home alone, but the only thing he can do is play with his imagination. Sometime later, after being bullied by a local gang of kids, the schoolboy imagines himself at Monster Island, becoming quick friends with the son of Godzilla, Minilla, trying to figure out what Minilla would do in the same situation. Meanwhile, a pair of bank robbers are on the run, only to come into contact with the schoolboy himself, kidnapping him in the process. Now held hostage by the two bank robbers, the schoolboy not only must fight his own inner demons, but also must figure out a way to escape and outsmart the two bank robbers. Can the schoolboy rely on his imagination to save the day? Or will he remain a hostage to the two bank robbers for the rest of his life? Now, before I begin my critique critique of the movie, I have a couple things to say. First off, I'm critiquing this movie based on its English dub because the DVD copy I own only has the English dub. And second, this is going to be a very hard critique for me, I will admit, because much like the original 1954 Godzilla movie, Godzilla's Revenge falls into that category of what can be said that hasn't been said already. But unlike the original 54 movie where that was a masterpiece, this one, a lot of people critique in terms of how bad it is, so who knows, maybe you'll hear something new from this review, or maybe you'll hear something you've heard before. But anywho, in terms of what I liked about the movie, and yeah, I'm actually kind of surprised I actually found anything to like in this movie, but moving on. The movie has a very memorable soundtrack in a sense of how strange it is, especially for a Godzilla movie, because if I had to describe the soundtrack to this movie, it's like a combination of jazz and funk, because on pen and paper, the idea of mixing two music genres like jazz and funk together wouldn't work, but strangely enough, the music composer found a way to mix these two genres together to make the soundtrack to this movie, and it strangely works. And the soundtrack is pretty memorable in its own right, which is impressive because the music wasn't composed by Ichiro Ifukube or Masahiro Sato. Instead, it was composed by Kunio Maedachi, the film composer who's primarily known for providing soundtracks to a lot of the Ultraman TV shows from around that time period. Another thing I liked about the movie is the way some clips of stock footage are edited together. And yes, I do have a problem with the movie using stock footage, which I'll talk about later. But anywho, the movie intercuts new footage of Ichiro on Monster Island and the stock footage from previous Godzilla movies in a way where it makes it look like Ichiro is interacting with the stock footage. For example, there is a moment in time where we see stock footage of Godzilla battling Ebara from Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster. And we have our main character watching the battle from a far distance, and at one point in the battle you see Ebara splashing Godzilla. And at that moment, it cuts away from the stock footage to the new footage of Ichiro and Minilla getting splashed on by the water, and then you have the two of them climbing to higher ground. And another thing I liked about this fight is the fact that it took two different battles from the same movie, but edited them in a way where it gives the illusion that it's really one battle, where it primarily takes the first 2/3 of the first fight from Godzilla vs. Ebara, and then takes like the conclusion of the second battle from the same movie and combines them together to form this one fight sequence, which I thought was pretty cool. And speaking of Minilla, the son of Godzilla, his appearance in this movie is so surreal to witness. Because not only is this the third Godzilla movie in a row to feature Minilla, but the way Minilla is depicted in this movie is drastically different than how he was depicted in the two Godzilla movies before this. For example, with Mina's first appearance in Son of Godzilla, he is a living, breathing creature who is depicted as a man-suit creation, and when you see him interacting with humans, it's done through green screen because Minilla is so much larger than the human characters to keep in scale. And when you see Minilla interacting with something that isn't done through green screen, he's usually interacting with puppets or other characters depicted using suitmation. With Mina's depiction in Godzilla's Revenge, he's a figment of Ichiro's imagination. And because of this, he is able to interact with Ichiro because he has the ability to grow and shrink, regardless if it's being half the size of Godzilla or shrinking down to the same size as Ichiro, but he also has the ability to talk. And the voice they give him for the English dub, I like for ironic reasons because he just sounds really goofy. Then again, seeing the visual of Minilla talking is just strange in its own right. But why I find the interaction between Ichiro and Minilla to be so surreal has to do with the fact that Ichiro is a human interacting with a character that's depicted in a man-suit creation. Because when you sit down and think about it, when you see Minilla interacting with the human characters from Son of Godzilla, it's done using green screen because they're to scale. And when you do see Minilla interacting with Godzilla, it's two actors acting in suitmation. So your mind gets really used to the fact that this is how they depict man-suit creations when interacting with humans or other suitmation characters. With this movie, on the other hand, having a kid character interacting with a character that's done in suitmation is just really surreal to look at. Because I am so more used to seeing the character in suitmation acting with other characters that are done in suitmation as opposed to interacting with a human character while not using any effects like green screen to have the monster character interact with the human character. As for the next aspect of the movie, I have mixed feelings towards the new monster, Gabara, because on one hand, I do like the fact that the producers behind the movie went out of their way to create a new monster exclusively for this movie, and the scenes revolved around him are pretty memorable. That being said, I think Gabara is one of the worst Godzilla villains within the franchise, for a couple reasons. One, the sound he makes is really annoying. Second, design-wise, it's so simplistic to a point that it's uninspired. Like, if I had to describe it, it's like a cross between a cat and a toad, which on pen and paper might sound like an interesting idea for a new giant monster, but wasn't executed properly. Also, the symbolization of what Gabara represents is not only stupid, but it's stupidly obvious, because Gabara is meant to be a physical representation of the bully who picks on Ichiro in the real world, who's also named Gabara. However, I do think that Gabara, despite being one of the worst Godzilla villains, has massive room for improvement in terms of design, origin, and characterization. Like, why not redesign him to look more like an Oni-esque demon from Japanese mythology, and instead of having Gabara be some physical manifestation of some bully that picks on the main character, why not have him be like an actual demon within Japanese mythology? That would be really cool. Instead, we get this very uninspired, cat-toad looking thing. However, the final monster battle with Godzilla and Minilla battling Gabara on Monster Island is actually a lot of fun. Another aspect of the movie that I have mixed feelings towards is the premise to the movie. Because on pen and paper, I think this would have made for a great drama movie if you understood the context in terms of when the movie was made. Because sometime during post-World War II Japan, there came to need to have an increasing number of women to join the workforce, which led to the creation of latchkey kids during 1960s Japan. And latchkey kids, for those of you who don't know, are kids that would often come home from school to an empty household because both parents would often work late into the night, thus giving us the premise to Godzilla's Revenge, because Ichiro is exactly that, a latchkey kid. And during one of his dream sequences, there's this moment in time where he's hanging out with Minilla. Then you hear this strange ringing sound, and Mina's covering his ears walking off screen. And several moments later, the surrounding environment Ichiro is standing in goes from being Monster Island to becoming this pitch black void. And then you see Ichiro yelling for his dad, which is a nice way to get to know a kid on a psychological level. However, that being said, even though there are some ingredients here for a good drama movie, I don't think it would make for a good Godzilla movie, because when you sit down and think about it, why do people watch Godzilla movies? People watch Godzilla movies to not only see Godzilla go on a rampage, but to see Godzilla fight against other monsters, and see how the human story either connects to the monster stuff, or see how it plays off the monster stuff. This here, Godzilla doesn't physically appear in the story, he only appears in these dream sequences. And sure, he does fight other monsters in the form of stock footage and Gabara, but I'll talk about the stock footage in a bit, and I've already said my piece on Gabara, so moving on to the movie itself, since Godzilla's Revenge, in the grand scheme of things, really doesn't matter in the long run, because Godzilla himself, as I said earlier, doesn't actually physically appear in the story. And like I said before, the movie itself has some great ideas for a psychological family drama, but maybe not so much for a Godzilla movie. In terms of what I disliked about the movie, actually, before I even address my first problem with the movie, I am very well aware of the fact that this particular problem I'm about to talk about is something that almost everyone has said about the movie, because it's one of the many reasons as to why the movie is disliked as much as it is. And if you're someone who's paid attention to this channel long enough, you would know that I don't like it when movies utilize this method of filmmaking, or lack thereof, because I find it to be incredibly lazy when it's used, unless if it's in short bursts. That being, the movie itself uses stock footage. Granted, this isn't the first time I've seen a Godzilla movie using stock footage before, because with something like Godzilla Rise Again, it used stock footage from the original 1954 movie to provide exposition in the form of a flashback. With Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, on the other hand, it uses stock footage from the original Rodan movie during Rodan's initial rampage sequence. But the way that stock footage is utilized in Godzilla vs. Monster Zero is intercut with new footage of both Godzilla and King Ghidorah going on a rampage in Tokyo. And when we do see some of that stock footage from Rodan, it's used in short bursts. With Godzilla's Revenge, on the other hand, it's nothing more than a glorified clip show because it takes stock footage not only from the 3 previous Godzilla movies, but also takes a little bit of stock footage from King Kong Escapes. Also, to on top of that, the ratio between the amount of stock footage used in the movie versus the amount of footage that was filmed for the movie almost feel balanced in a bad way, because the movie itself has a runtime of 70 minutes, and I think of those 70 minutes, 20 of those minutes are dedicated to nothing but stock footage from previous Godzilla movies. Another problem I had with the movie is the movie's overall tone, as far as it being a Godzilla movie goes, because to me, it never really felt like a Godzilla movie. Instead, it feels more like a coming-of-age comedy that just so happens to feature some elements in relation to Godzilla, but not actually featuring Godzilla. Which leads into another problem that I have with the movie. Does Godzilla actually exist within the context of this universe? Because the only time we ever see Godzilla, or anything in relation to Godzilla, is usually in the form of the dreams that Ichiro has throughout the movie. And when the movie doesn't take place within Ichiro's dreams, we are instead focused on the daily life of Ichiro in the real world. And during these sequences, it's made unclear whether or not Godzilla exists within this universe as a real character, or does he exist within this universe as a fictional one? We just don't know. Which might be the main reason as to why I have such a problem with this movie in the sense of its tone. Another problem that I had with the movie is the English dub, for a couple reasons. The first reason being the fact that when you really listen to a lot of the lines of dialogue in this, they're not only written badly, but the way some of the voice actors deliver said lines of dialogue is just as bad. Also, some of the voices that some of these characters are given are just terrible to listen to. From the likes of the annoying high-pitched voice that Ichiro has, the grumpy mumbles that come from the bank robbers, to the voice that the little girl has that sounds less like a little girl and more like a full-grown woman. And as far as some of the other character voices go, they just sound bored. Another sound-related problem I have is with the sound effects themselves when we're in the real-world setting, because there are certain points in time in which we have characters either walking or knocking on doors, and the volume to these sound effects should be a lot louder, but they're not. Like, they're so quiet that I could barely hear them. Then you have the soundtrack itself, in terms of when it's used during certain points in time. Because within the first 8 minutes, there are several scenes where we just have shots of the city landscape, and we hear the main theme of the movie playing in the background. And then a few seconds later, when we're focused on Ichiro interacting with some of his neighbors, this whimsical music just starts playing. Like, there is no beat and rhythm as to how we get from one musical score to another. It just happens. Then there are some points in time where there is no soundtrack playing in the background. Granted, it really depends on the scene, because you have some scenes that really don't need a soundtrack playing in the background, but then there are some scenes where I do think a soundtrack would have benefited the scene. Especially the climax of the movie where we have Ichiro outsmarting the bank robbers, because for a good chunk of that action sequence, it's just really awkward silence. And by the time we get to the end of that sequence, there is some music playing in the background, but I think it would have been a lot better if there was more music playing throughout that whole entire sequence. Another problem that I have with the movie is the movie's pacing, because the movie itself is a little over an hour in length. Yet when you sit down and watch the movie, it doesn't feel like an hour has gone by. If anything, the movie feels a lot longer than it should be, because the pacing to this movie is really slow, to a point that it makes the movie feel much longer than it really is. Another problem that I have with the movie is the film quality itself during certain sequences, because when we're focused on Ichiro interacting with Minilla on Monster Island, the film quality looks great because of how clean it is. Yet when we're focused in the real world setting, there's some points in time where the film quality doesn't look very good, to a point where you could see a lot of the film grain. Granted, I do own a older DVD release of Godzilla's Revenge, so that could be the main reason as to why some scenes have good film quality while other scenes don't. Another problem that I have with the movie is the job profession of Shinpei, the neighbor that often takes care of Ichiro while his parents are at work. Because Shinpei's job occupation is that of a toy maker. And why do I have a problem with this? It contributes nothing to the movie. Now sure, Shinpei himself does take part in the movie near the end where he's seen calling the police after spotting a stolen car with a stolen bag of cash, but him being a toy maker doesn't really amount to anything. And the thing is, there are several ways in which Shinpei being a toy maker could contribute to the story of Godzilla's Revenge. In one of three scenarios. The first scenario, have it be that Shinpei sells nothing but Godzilla merchandise to all the kids in Ichiro's neighborhood. And Ichiro helps, but maybe he doesn't know who or what Godzilla is and doesn't really understand the appeal. Thus, you can have Shinpei explain the history of the Godzilla franchise up to that point. The second solution to fix this problem, if Shinpei was still a toy maker, is maybe have the movie play out the way it does, but maybe have it be sometime during the first act, Shinpei gives Ichiro some toys to play with, and maybe Ichiro uses these toys in the last third of the movie to help him fight against the bandits. Or, third scenario, you could have it be that Shinpei, instead of being a toy maker, is a film projectionist, and maybe within the scenario, Ichiro doesn't really understand the appeal of the Godzilla franchise, which leads Shinpei to set up a Godzilla festival in which he, Ichiro, and a bunch of other Godzilla fans watch a Godzilla marathon, and Shinpei explains the appeal of the Godzilla franchise to Ichiro. So in some shape or form, I feel like if this movie was given a few more rewrites, there could have been a scenario in which Shinpei being a toy maker does contribute to the story, but as it sits, him being a toy maker is completely irrelevant to the plot of the movie. Then there's a few parts of the movie that didn't quite make sense to me. The big one being, while Ichiro is being held hostage by the bank robbers, why doesn't he escape? Because as the scene sits, you have one of the bank robbers looking for a mode of transportation to escape with, while the other bandit is not only watching the kid, but he's also looking to see if his partner obtained a mode of transportation. And while this is going on, Ichiro just sits in a chair by himself. And the thing is, he isn't tied up or anything. He actually does have the opportunity to escape the clutches of this one bandit, but he doesn't. Instead, he just sits there and waits as the other bandit shows up. Which also means the bandits are idiots for not tying the kid up sooner. Another thing that doesn't make sense to me are the way the fight scenes near the end of the movie are choreographed. Because instead of having these nice wide shots with the occasional close-ups and being filmed at a normal speed, instead, most of the fights are filmed up close and personal, and the camera speed has this stuttering effect throughout the entire fight scene. Like, the way these fight scenes were filmed, I found to be both annoying and unnecessary in terms of how they were both shot and edited together. Another thing that didn't make sense about the fight scenes was the placement of the random Gabara footage. Because Gabara, as I said earlier, is meant to be a physical representation of the bully that picks on Ichiro. And the thing is, when you have Ichiro battling the main bank robber at the very end, it does this weird thing where it cuts back and forth between the bank robber and Gabara, as if the bank robber is meant to be a physical representation of Gabara at that moment. And this doesn't make any sense to me because, as I said earlier, the monster Gabara is meant to be a physical representation of the bully that picks on Ichiro. So wouldn't it make more sense to have the last fight between Ichiro and his bully and have that intercut with Minilla battling Gabara? And perhaps my biggest problem with the movie is the moral of the story. That being, when confronted by bullies, stand up for yourself. And I have several problems with this. One, I'm pretty sure this idea has been done better in other kids' movies. And second, the way it's executed is very questionable. Because sometime near the beginning of the movie, Ichiro is confronted by the group of bullies, and they tell him in order to get this one item back from them, he has to commit a prank on this painter who's several feet off the ground doing his job by going up to his motorcycle and honking his horn. And at first, Ichiro just ignores the bullies and then just walks home. Now, fast forward sometime near the end of the movie, after Ichiro beats up the main bully and then begins to walk off, they could have had a scene in which Maybe you had all the other bullies walk up to Ichiro, apologize to them, and then maybe Ichiro forms a friendship with the main bully, and then they all begin to walk to school together as a unit. Instead, the final scene has Ichiro doing what the bullies dare him to do at the beginning of the movie, which ends in a prank that I found to be both dangerous and disrespectful. Which makes me wonder, what is the actual message to this movie? Is it A, stand up for yourself, B, if you can't beat the group of bullies, join them, or C, if you can beat up the group of bullies, join them anyways? And as for my last major problem with the movie, actually has nothing to do with the movie itself. It has more to do with the group of people who defend the movie, saying, hey guys, leave the movie alone, it's a movie that's aimed at little kids. And I find this to be a rather poor excuse to defend the movie. Because when it comes to critiquing movies, it doesn't matter if it's a movie that's aimed at adults or little kids, it has the potential to be good or bad. For example, let's compare the 1991 animated Disney classic Beauty and the Beast and compare that with the 2017 animated movie, The Emoji Movie. Now sure, the one thing that these two movies have in common is the fact that both movies are aimed at a younger demographic. But here's where the two movies differ. With Beauty and the Beast, the combination of the story, characters, the dialogue, the animation, soundtrack, and the thematics are done so well that when combined together form a good movie. With the Emoji Movie, on the other hand, the combination of story, characters, dialogue, animation, and thematics are handled so poorly that it became a bad movie. And when you hear people talking about these movies, Beauty and the Beast gets really good reception, whereas the Emoji Movie gets really bad reception. And here's the thing, people just critique these as movies. Like, you never hear anyone say the reason as to why either movie was good or bad was because it was aimed at little kids. Instead, you hear people talk about how one movie was executed very well, while the other movie was executed very poorly. And when you sit down and think about it, movies aimed at kids have come a very long way. Because when you do see a movie aimed at kids that gets good reception, it usually gets a ton of praise by the general masses because of how good it is. Yet, when you see a movie aimed at kids that gets bad reception, it usually ends up getting bad reception because people realize that not only have kids' movies come a long way, but the age-old saying goes, kids deserve better. And I am completely sorry for that side tangent, but it just needed to be said. Although, speaking of movies aimed at kids, I think by having Godzilla's Revenge be a movie aimed at little kids was really redundant in the grand scheme of things, because when you sit down and think about no matter what Godzilla movie you're watching, regardless if it's a Godzilla movie from the early Shōwa series, a Godzilla movie from the Heisei series or Millennium series, I think little kids will enjoy seeing Godzilla on screen no matter what. So, for my final verdict of Godzilla's Revenge, upon rewatching the movie after all these years later, I get what the filmmakers were trying to do with the movie in terms of its thematics, and I will admit there are some parts in the movie that I do like, mainly the battle with Godzilla and Minilla battling Gabara. That being said, I don't think this movie needed to exist as a Godzilla movie, because it really doesn't contribute anything worthwhile to the Godzilla franchise. And even then, I don't really consider this movie to be a Godzilla movie because Godzilla himself doesn't appear within the actual story. Instead, the movie's more of a glorified stand-up-for-yourself kids movie than an actual Godzilla movie. But even then, I think there's much better movies out there that do the whole stand-up-for-yourself routine than something like Godzilla's Revenge. And out of all the Godzilla movies that I've covered up to this point, this is the first Godzilla movie in which I can say you can honestly skip it because you're really not missing much in the grand scheme of things. So overall, Godzilla's Revenge is nothing more than a glorified clip show that has some well-intended meaning behind it, but is handled very poorly. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Godzilla's Revenge? So it looks like the movie got genuinely negative reviews. Personally, I'm not surprised. And so for my final rating of Godzilla's Revenge, I give it a 1.5 out of 5. So, what's a movie that's aimed at kids that you think is terrible? And see you later.